Hello, everyone. Marco here from Memgraph, and welcome to another Memgraph community call. I'm very happy to have John Thomas here today with us. So, John is a founder and CEO of GraphLogic, and basically, he will be walking us through the platform that they have built on Memgraph and various other kind of technologies, and basically talk to us about how GraphRAG systems kind of retrieve context, and then what actually happens if reasoning itself kind of lives in the graph. This should be super fun because um, basically it's going to be a presentation of the product and kind of its capabilities. So basically, without teasing it further, I'll leave the stage to John. So, John, feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Marco. And thanks, everybody, for joining. I'm going to give you a brief overview. We obviously don't have enough time to go into all the details, but I'm going to give you some background as to why GraphLogic, why we started it. Marco and I were having a conversation just before the call, kind of reiterate why we are building this platform. And then I do want to say this is pre-release, right? So we're in the process of building it. And the takeaway is I want you to understand what we're trying to do. And then if you are interested, right, the ask is do reach out, right? We're looking for, I would say, no more than 10 organizations through this cohort we want to establish with folks that really understand Memgraph to be part of a cohort where we can work together to improve this platform. So why GraphLogic, right? What does this mean by understanding what matters most? So a little background on myself. I've worked in IT for more years, decades than I want to tell you about. Most of the time I was supporting large organizations. Myself, I worked in organizations that would have 60, 80,000 people. The organizations we were supporting as large as that or larger. A lot of times it got very frustrating because we just didn't understand what it is we're trying to do. We kind of knew, we know the big picture, we know where we're going, but behind the covers, right? How many times you walked out of a meeting and said, I don't understand, or this is crazy, or I didn't even know that was happening. What happened, right? So how do we connect the dots? How do we pull all this together to get that enterprise understanding into one system? Because right now, we don't, right? It's really hard to do that. So the reason is the information lives in silos, right? We've got data in warehouses, we've got decisions in inboxes, PowerPoint charts. No one person or one system has all the information, right? So you might have hundreds of different databases, different tools with different varieties of the data, all in their own silos. And then you have how do we answer these questions, right? How do we pull all this together? And AI is great, right? There's a lot of talk about, hey, AI is going to solve all this and how, as Marco said, RAG systems improve it. We believe there's a better way of doing that. And the better way is GraphLogic, right? And again, with the AI, right, it's made intelligence cheap. These are phenomenal tools, right? Whether you love Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or Grok or whatever it is, right? Amazing capability. But the problem is the understanding at an enterprise level, right? So you can point AI at anything. Like you point it at documents, you can get a phenomenal report back that says, hey, this is the way you should derive your marketing plan, or this is the way you should do your cloud migration. Problem is that's a one-time shot. Now, how do you keep this intelligence that you generated to where it's reusable and understandable throughout the enterprise? So that's the premise of GraphLogic, right? We have the context graph. And a lot of you familiar with graph technologies, you might have saw late last year, Foundation Capital, big venture firm here in the United States, said it's $1 trillion opportunity, right? Context graphs. Really understanding that we got to get everything in the graph to really be able to make these tough decisions. And so you have to do that, right? You have to get the data into the graph. You got to model your world. Like, what is it we're doing? What are, from the highest level, like, what are our goals? How's our team structured? What are the decisions that we need to make? And then you need to reason upon it. So thus the graph and the logic. So when we started the platform, we started really building the logic around formal logic, if then else statements, right? These are business rules. And then we realized that with this forefront of AI, we really had the opportunity to go beyond just formal logic and look at informal logic. The way we as humans think, right? We structure arguments, particularly when you're trying to think as a group, right? You may have an argument. Somebody may rebuttal your argument, right? What's the evidence based upon the premise that you're putting forth? All of that can be put into the graph, right? So that was the really, I would say, advancement of the platform over the last years we've been building it, is we moved from this formal logic. We still have it, right? We have something called graph rules where you can reason upon graph data. But we've expanded that with informal logic. So you can build out an entire argumentation model and understand why you are making these decisions. And that's where AI comes in, because you can throw AI at a problem and it can give you an answer. And it may be a very good answer, but in 6 months later, if you have to, why did you make that decision? Well, I don't know. Like the AI said so, right? That's not good enough. So what you need is that foundation that you can drive through there and really make AI a collaborator in your reasoning. Now, I can't see the screen, Marco, because I'm looking at my presentation. I do want to say, if anybody has a question at any time, and Marco, please be the conduit there. Please let me know, right? This should be an open dialogue. We've only got a short period of time here. So if you have a question about how we do this, please ask. So the graph, the logic, AI is that foundation that's taking you from insight into action. And, oops, went the wrong way. So a little bit deeper, right? I kind of talked about this, where we, it says 6 architectural layers. That's just for the one thing I'm going to show you. But the context model is very expressive, right? You can model anything in here. We've got over 700 different entities, which we call concept types and connection types. And we've really worked on how do we structure that in a way that is expressive, is understandable by the AI, and most importantly, can be consumed by the AI, right? So if you have 700 different entity types, nodes, 700 different edges, types, right? That can be millions of combinations. You have to be able to structure that in a way that's still semantically relevant, but also something that can be expressed well, right? So we did a lot of work on how we structure the graph. And again, if you guys have any questions on that, I'm happy to answer some questions there. The reasoning, I talked about it. We have the argumentation. We have also the formal logic in a graph layer, right? So now we have something called logic flows, right? So the logic flow can look at a rule, like a business rule. Then it could traverse the graph and actually pull information from that graph and pull that into the reasoning layer. So it's more than just here's a data frame and here's a set of rules I want you to run on that. This is more interactive. It's looking at the graph, it's looking at the logic, and it's going through there and making the proper decisions. And then the AI piece fits across both of this, right? So we have AI agents that you can talk to, right? There's something we call the home agent. It's sitting there on your desktop. You can talk to it and understands the context of what's happening. And then under the scenes, we have a lot of work that's going on as far as how we structure the work, how you go through some reasoning life cycle. So to make that work, you've got to be able to connect the data, right? So we're integrating the Memgraph 0 piece. So those that have looked at that, we are also looking at it to be able to federate data across multiple data sources. We also have the ability to just go to point-specific sources. So you might have an API to Salesforce. You might have a database. You might have a GitHub repository. All those can be connected into the platform. And then once that's connected, what we do is we reason through it. And It's structured reasoning around this life cycle I'll talk about. And it's also, you can structure it around, I'm interested in this problem, right? So you can, what we call an engagement. So you can start up an engagement and then spin up different threads, reasoning threads, that walk through that engagement to help you figure it out, right? And then we have a series of tools and solutions that are on the delivery side. And that's where the opportunity also aligns to those of you that are in this call that are interested in building graph-based solutions for others, right? It could be internal. You want to build a solution internally for your team, your stakeholders, or you might want to build a solution for others, or you may want to incorporate your capability into the GraphLogic ecosystem. So we're open to all of those kind of discussions. So this is just one view, right? You can have an architectural view that shows how all this stuff is connected. That's just one tool in the toolbox. Again, there's reasoning that goes on behind all the information. Here's everything on this screen here. The parts of the architecture, those are all modeled in the graph, right? All the edges are modeled in the graph, and the graph can reason upon that. And how it reasons is this process we call leap. So when we were looking at, particularly, at the advent of these modern AI tools, it was like, well, how do we improve upon existing way of thinking about things? So one thing in my background from the defense industry, there's something called the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, act, right? And we're like, well, observe is great, but with all these tools, we can do so much more, right? We can only observe, we can learn, we can understand very rapidly with the advent of AI and human intelligence, and use different techniques in the learning phase to really not only get an understanding of what's happening now, but what is happening in the past and in the future. So we use different techniques like Bayesian techniques to look at the data and say, this data is fresh, this is changing, this is what we said 6 months ago, and this is the reality of today, right? So that's more of a Bayesian learning. The envisioning is more of an approach where you take multiple views, right? So you spin up multiple agents, every agent has their own view, and then we go through this process, what we call the triad, where you might have people or agents that are acting like a protagonist and antagonist. And you have a mediator that comes back and says, hey, this looks like some of the next best actions we should take to solve this problem. And then we monitor the action, right? So as an organization, you're acting upon it. We can monitor that. And then the perfect phase is where we look at your actions. You said you were going to do this. Here's the actions you took. Here's the result. Is that what you expected? Not necessarily, because early on you said you were going to achieve this goal and you didn't. So what happened? Right? What went wrong? What went right? How do we take that and improve that into lessons learned and what we call wisdom, where that wisdom gets fed back into the reasoning engine, so the reasoning is always improving. And again, if you have any questions at any time, there's a lot, so please feel free to ask a question. So I hit on this a little bit, right? You have this
John,
reasoning
workspace. John, there's one question. What kind of file types does it support? And when we reason and explain, how are we making sure that that the data has structure? And when agent, I'm a little bit, there's no full stops on the question, has structure, and when agent found the data, how does it reason? To support the reasoning by AI, what are we doing to enable that?
Yeah, sure. Good question. Absolutely. So we do have a graph, right? I'm getting an echo. I don't know if is that me or somebody else. Is it okay? Okay. So we do have the graph. The data is in the graph, and yes, that's the pristine data, right? We do have this thing called a curate, where we can take a document, could be any type of document that AI can read, right? We'll read that document in, and we will go through this curation process where we'll extract the things that we believe are relevant to the engagement. So you can see this engagement over here. The organization, right? So it understands your organization. All this stuff's in the graph. You have to prime the graph. So it says, hey, here's my organization. Here's this engagement. Here's the context around that engagement. Here's some documents now that we believe are relevant to it. Then we prime the AI, we give it directives to say, hey, go through here, extract the information that we believe is relevant to this engagement space, and place it into the graph. Now, that's not easy, right? So there's a lot of work that has to go on. I'm not saying we have the end-all be-all. I know there's others out there. If you join some of the other calls, right, this is yet another opportunity to kind of plug people's capabilities in. So if you have, say, a better capability to extract information out of documents, that's fine, right? We can plug that into GraphLogic. We're not just a graph, right? We also do RAG, right? So we have a document. In fact, when documents come in, we vectorize it, we chunk it up, and then we do the reasoning on that graph to do the extraction, right? And there's a variety of techniques that occur under that. So that was the one question. Hopefully I answered that. Is there something else, Marco, I missed?
No. So far, so good.
Okay. All right. So the data comes in. We now say, all right, we have this problem, right? I want to look at how do we expand into Asia. And now that the agents and the humans, right, we can talk about that engagement. We can spin up different threads, and those threads are distinct pieces of reasoning based upon that engagement, right? So the models might say, this type of engagement is going to require these numbers of thought processes, and it'll spin up the threads, and then it'll go through its thinking. And at certain points, it'll need human input, right? And that's where it calls on the tools. So the tools are this executive primitive that understands how to do certain things, like that architecture diagram I showed previously. So at some point, it may say, let's talk about more of a technical thing, not expanding to Asia. How do I do cloud migration, right? I need to migrate these applications to the cloud. All right, well, we need to build out the architecture documents that say what's in scope, right, and understand that. So then it'll call on the tool to say, all right, yeah, I need you to define your future state architecture based upon what we have today. And then you use the tool. That tool then expresses that information back into the graph. You can have collaboration on it. You can discuss it. And then ultimately, it leads to some decision, some next best action to say, this is how we're going to move these sets of applications to the cloud. That's just one example. It could be anything, right? It could be strategy all the way down to the lowest level of like code inspection, right? So again, let me know if anybody has any questions, but that's how we reason. So I'm going to show you, I know we're going to run out of time. There's no way to show everything today, but I'll give you a sense of what's in scope of the platform and how it works. So let me bounce out of here. And again, this is a good time for a question if anybody has it. If not, no problem. Okay, so this is just an example. This is running on my machine. You can see this is localhost, so it's not like this requires a huge amount of infrastructure. This is not a science project. I do want to say that. There's about 1 million lines, more than 1 million lines of code all in this project, split between the back end and the front end. And then there's a lot of work that's gone on in defining all these different concept types and the directives to tell the agents how to work, how to collaborate, right? So there's a lot that's inside of GraphLogic. Again, this is pre-release, so it's going to have warts, it's going to have bumps. Things might not work when I show it, but what I want to get across is the direction that we're going with this product. Right? I mean, I would expect in the next 2-3 months we will have a final release. And again, we're looking for 10 people in a cohort of people that really understand Memgraph that'd be interested in joining us in making this product really work for them. So I'm going to log in as David here. Now it showed, it goes to what's hot, right? So this is what's hot for David. Now, you can have different organizations, right? So we support up to 6 layers of an organizational structure. It can be more, that's just where we stopped, right? So at the highest level, we're a global org enterprise. So now all the information, all the reasoning is at a global org enterprise level. Now I can go into Office of any level, right? I can go down and pick an organizational level that I want to uh, scope my effort against. The other thing is, you saw I logged in as David, who's a CIO, but David also has, because he's a high level executive, right? He has the opportunity to use a variety of profiles. So he's logged in as his CIO profile right now, but if he wanted to, right, or she wanted to, she can say, go and look at it from an enterprise architecture point of view. And now how the models think, how it's looking at the information is different, right? Not only that, but we also have things called focus lenses. So maybe David as CIO really wants to focus on digital service delivery. Now the information that's presented, the reasoning, everything is going to be focused on digital services delivered, right? So all of that's infrastructure just to help David with his world that's very complex. Now think about if you didn't have GraphLogic, what would David do? Well, he would come in, he'd grab some documents, he'd throw it at AI, or he would just have to work without a product, or he'd go across a bunch of different data stores. He'd pull information from the portal. He might do some RAG stuff to figure out what's happening. But every time he's got to reset that context. What we're doing is we're holding that context for you. So we know that, hey, you're at this organization. This is your role. This is what you're really interested in. And now let's talk about that. These what's hot are just narratives. So this is generated for David. So this is like, hey, David, these are your next moves, right, that you have. The other thing, let me just show like down here so you can kind of understand organizationally, right? So this is kind of David's organization that he lives in. Again, big global organization, lots of different entities, right? So you can look at it hierarchical. You could. The other thing is, I've built a lot of graph-based systems in the past, and one thing that always is a challenge is, things like this are very powerful when you're doing outlier analysis or you're looking for clusters. It's really hard to look at that and say what's what. Now, if you're doing something like a hierarchical thing, okay, that helps me. I could kind of see this organization, or if you're doing more science-oriented things, maybe it helps to have a 3D view. But generally, you need that view and you need different views. So in this case, we have a list view, a card view, right? The other thing, perspectives are stored, and there's a variety of things that we store in the system, like frameworks. So if you're using, say, I need to do NIST 800, whatever, or ISO 27001, right? There's existing art, which is basically, here's how we structure this information in GraphLogic. So there's always something that you go back to, right? It's like, okay, this is relevant to this control set. This is the control. Here it is inside of the graph. I talked about the leap cycle, right? So you can have different findings, right? And these are findings that can be generated. Sorry, that's not very good data there, but different findings are related by the AI itself going through it, or you as a human, you can say, hey, I see something here that's interesting to me. And then that gets into the reasoning world where you can now reason across that structure. Quick actions, exploring, right? So I might run a query. That one didn't do anything. Demo gods. Not coming back anything. I don't know if I got a problem on the back end. Maybe so. That's interesting. But let's see. Some of the other things we built is the ability to structure a query, a graph query, in a graphical manner, right? So what we use is something called patterns, right? So you can have, I want to look for a control that's got this relationship to this risk. The other thing we had to do is we wanted to be agnostic, right? We love Memgraph, and there's a lot of benefits for having Memgraph as the engine, and it's our first and foremost engine. But what we've done is we've created a different structure for how we query the graph, because we needed a little bit more than just the standard graph query, right? We needed to be able to do Bayesian analysis and look at change events. So there's something we call change events that are stored in the graph, and those change events are stored in the graph, but then also persisted in other ways. So I can look at a change event and I can say, okay, this thing has changed 6 times over the last 3 months. The graph query allows us to do that. And then we can do different things like aggregations, or you can embed an algorithm, and that gets into more of the what we call the logic flow, right? To where it's not just a graph query, it's a graph query with logic that's bound to it. So that is a little bit more deeper than just, hey, let me run this graph query and see what it says. It's run this graph query, now run some rules upon it, and even do a summary of that information so now I can understand what's happening there. We talked about document ingestion. We could do document ingestion. You have the ability to resolve, curate, capture things. We're going to run out of time here. But then the tools or under delivery, the different tools and tasks that you have. So in this case, here's things that David has on his plate, different tools that are in the system that we're building out. These are all based upon more of basic things that you'd have to do in a reasoning lifecycle, as well as things that are relevant to IT management, right? So we're really focused on IT management. That's going to be our first, suite of capabilities that comes out the door. But we're looking for partners that can actually extend it. You all come from your own world. You've got your own problems. You're trying to solve things your own way. So we'd love to talk to you about how we can build out tools that can help you with your quest. Let's see. And getting low on time. Was there any other questions?
No, not so far. Not so far.
Okay. Let me go back here. So the big thing about having everything in the graph and building logic upon it, right? Now you know how it connects, right? You can defend your decision, and now you get more return on investment from the AI, right? Because it's grounded in the context, you're not just throwing a bunch of documents and doing RAG on the system, right? You're extracting the relevant information from that, you're pulling it out, and you're making decisions on that information. You're putting it back into the graph. So what we're looking for, again, is people that are domain experts. Maybe you're a developer, you want to develop some graph-based technologies, or you want to co-create capabilities on GraphLogic. That's what we're really interested in, right? Please reach out to me if you're interested in. What we usually do is, we've got several things in flight right now where we like to prove out a problem, right? So give us a hard problem. Let's see how we can solve that. And then hopefully, right, if we do a good job and we understand the problem and we come up with a set of solutions, then we get to a project where we can actually operationalize that in your domain. And then hopefully we scale that out across your organization, right? So
John, there's a question.
Sure.
What is the cost of the agents that are running all the time on each user, approximately?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a bring your own model, right? So we're an open platform. You would run this in your infrastructure. We can run it in the cloud. You can run it in our cloud, but it's your subscriptions, right? Your APIs, right? So we're not like a SaaS provider today. We can do that if you want us to, but it's really up to you, right? If you love Claude, if you love ChatGPT, if you love whatever, fine. If you want to use a local model, right? It's not saying that you have to do everything on a frontier model. There's certain things that are well suited for like Quinn, right? Where we're building a narrative that's based upon graph data. I don't need a frontier model to build a narrative around that, right? I just need something that's good enough that's going to present that information in a way that's digestible to humans. So it's really up to you, and it's up to Now, what I would say, right, if you're looking at the trade of how am I using AI today versus how can I use it tomorrow with GraphLogic, you're going to be much more effective using something on a graph, because what we're doing is we're distilling all that information that's really important to you, and we're now feeding that. So the amount of tokens that are going into the AI is much, much less than like, hey, read this 100-page document. And the information that's coming out is very distinct, right? It's build this graph, right? Give me this information in this manner. So we're really cutting down on the input and the output tokens that are going into it. In some cases, we've seen like 90% decrease in how many tokens you're using. So hopefully I answered that question. Any other questions?
No, not so far.
Okay. So again, like, kind of get off the stage thing if there's no more questions, right? What we love is for you to join the ecosystem, right? This is all pre-release. We're going to be live in 2-3 months. Now's the time to really get on the forefront of this, work together. Let's figure out how we can connect the dots in your enterprise. If you're interested in building out a solution based upon your capabilities, want to figure out how we can join these things together, let's discuss, right? Let's connect. Please reach out to me, John at graphlogic.com. Looking forward to having these discussions. Again, we've got 3 that we're actively working. We've got a couple more that we're working on, and we're learning a lot, right? We're learning every time we have another engagement. We're like, oh, we need this capability, we need that capability. So the one thing, the people that we're currently working with, they don't really know Memgraph that well, right? So I'm really looking for some folks that really, love Memgraph or all in on Memgraph. And I think there's an opportunity there to really improve the value that we can deliver together.
Amazing. Thank you, John, and thank you for the kind words. There's one question that came in. I'll put it on the screen. So when we say we extract the data relevant, when we say we extract the data relevant, does user have input on what's important to him?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so there's so we have rules that say, well, again, when you're looking at it from the organizational standpoint, you're saying that's more high level, right? The organization doesn't help too much on this, but I would say it helps some. Then when you're looking at it from a lens standpoint that says, okay, I'm looking at it from a cybersecurity standpoint. Now it's going to look at those documents through the lens of cybersecurity, and it's going to look for things that are relevant. So it's going to call back to the database of all the different concepts and connections that we have. And it's first going to, the first pass is like, okay, based upon this context, what are the concepts that we think are going to be relevant to this engagement? That's the first pass. Second pass is, I think I've found these, and it'll curate those and it'll put those in a holding bin to say, I think this is relevant, right? And now you can, depending on if you want it automatic, to say, yeah, go ahead and push that. What we found is, like, you probably want to be careful there, right? You don't want a bunch of garbage in your system, because then it's kind of impacting your ability to reason. So you want to be really careful about how you curate information that comes in. That's just one use case, right? That's taking it from a document and extracting information from a document. The other thing is, we can pull in data from any source, right? So if you want to talk to a SQL database where it's very, clear data, this is our data, we can do that, right? So we can run a query against a SQL database, and we could pull that information and we could reason upon it and then summarize it. And we don't have to pull all that information into the graph per se, right? There might be things we want to pull into the graph, but we don't have to pull in everything, right? The one thing we don't want to be is this big data dump of everything within your organization. What we'd rather do is, and that's why we love Memgraph Zero, and that approach is, use Memgraph Zero to go out there and pull create these connections and then pull that information together. I mentioned our ability to talk Gremlin and Cypher, right? Cypher being the language of Memgraph, and Gremlin, mainly because world I came from, right? There's a lot of big data platforms like DataStax. So we want to be able to talk to them as well. And that's why we have the Gremlin piece. But there's also the GraphQL, right? So we are building that into the system as well. So when you express a graph query or a federated query, it'll say, aha, I have this memgraph store. I'm going to structure that as cipher. Maybe I have a big, data stacks warehouse in the sky. I need to talk to that in Gremlin. Great. Or if I'm going through Memgraph and I want this federated query, then I talk to, I construct a GraphQL, right? So that's all in the platform. You don't have to worry about that. It just comes out of the box where we speak these different dialects. And that's just talking graph, right? Again, it's SQL. It's being able to look at vector stores. It's being able to, we use a variety of databases behind the scenes. So it's not just, we have the graph, we have Postgres, we have I mentioned the Bayesian reasoning where we have to do reasoning over time, right? Best way to do it is a time series database. So we have a time series database that we look at. We have key value stores that are storing some of the things that need to be more transient, but you don't want to pollute the graph with a bunch of information. So we've really spent a lot of time thinking about how we structure the back end to where it's very flexible, very pluggable. And again, if you've got a better tool to do, like I've got the best thing that understands my organization and can do the curation of information from a document, that's fine, right? We can take that, plug it into the system. If you want to use ours, that's fine as well. Any other questions?
No, not anymore. Maybe a final question from my side. So, GraphLogic, like what are the I guess types of users or kind of the number one, if you were to choose any kind of I guess use case that would people kind of use, what would you really target for? What would you search for? What would you find?
Yeah, I think it's those hard problems that are go above and beyond like just using the latest greatest tools from Claude or Anthropic, ChatGPT, Gemini, right? You're really looking at a problem that's large enough to where you need to structure it. So when I was supporting a bunch of organizations and trying to do digital transformation of large organizational enterprises, right? I'm talking about thousands of applications, a variety of rules. You got unfunded mandates. Thou shall do this. Thou shall do that. Thou's got to be cybersecurity compliant, right? We've got to do these types of things. That's so difficult without something like GraphLogic, right? What I saw was people struggling, sitting there in meetings saying, I think this is the way to go. And then 2 weeks later, the world changed. It's become information that they weren't privy to is now coming to the table, and now you've got to change the way you're thinking, right? What we want to do is change that. We want to get all that information as much as we can into the reasoning platform to where you're really making good reasoning, right? To where as you're going through that reasoning engagement, at the end result, it's something that's tangible, valuable, that couldn't be done with just graph technologies by itself or just RAG or AI technologies by themselves. It's that combination of the graph with the agentic thinking with the tooling, right? That's going to solve that problem. You can use it for a small problem, sure, right? But where the value really comes out of Marco is when the problem is bigger than anything you can put in your head, and that's for y'all to decide as to how big is the problem that I can fit not only in my head but everybody on my team's head, right? And that's where it gets fun. So the one company we're working with, they have work in Azure DevOps. They have smart sheets. They have homegrown tools. They have other tools, and you've got development, marketing, sales, project delivery, and they are struggling, right? Because they got some major projects that are in flight. they don't understand the impact of what the decisions they're making. And this is no disrespect to anybody on this call that's in sales, but I worked for a wonderful sales guy who happened to be a program lead. And his answer was, no matter what the customer says, the answer is always yes. So what happens to them, right, is their customer is asking a question, their salespeople are saying, yeah, sure, we can do that. And then when it goes back to the back end, they're like, what commitment did you just make? Do you understand the impact? So by having everything in a system, what we're doing is helping them get that visibility, right? And trying to train the people to say, hey, before you make a commitment off the cuff, why don't you put that in here and let's look at it and think about the impact, right? Some of that's just training. Others is just understanding, right? It's a lack of understanding. The development doesn't understand the challenges of the project team. The project team really doesn't understand the challenges of the development team. These are problems that happen all over the place. No matter what organization I've been in, problems out there. So that's just one really good example of where we're using it to help them.
Amazing. Yeah, no, that's a real world problem. The connection and making sure everyone's in sync in terms of the expectations and ability to deliver as well. So great. Well, thank you so much, John, for a wonderful presentation. I think so. There was a couple of questions, which is great. If anyone wants to outreach to John and basically get connected, John at GraphLogic.com, and yeah, I will all take you. Well, basically, I'll say thank you to everyone for joining, and I'll leave you to the rest of the week and the rest of the day, and we'll see you on the other side on one of the future community calls. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Marco. Thanks, everybody.